Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Trail Talk High Pointing podcast. I'm your host, Lauren, and the high pointer that we're speaking with today is Jason McDonald from Colorado. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks. And before we get started, I just want to show everybody on YouTube my new coffee mug. It is the Rooftops of America merch. Do you ever watch Rooftops of America on YouTube?
I've not.
It's a former guest I've had on the show. He has a YouTube channel called Rooftops of America, and it's basically like a deep dive into every high point. And it's super interesting. He goes like way into the history and the geology and everything. And it's super cool, nerdy facts about high points. And he just opened up his like merch shop. So I told him I would get a coffee mug and I would drink from it on the episodes. So
Nice.
All right, Jason. So tell everyone what got you started in the outdoors and what got you high pointing.
Well, I grew up here in Colorado. I'm a city kid, though. I didn't grow up in the mountains. I grew up in the Denver metro area. So I actually was a city sports kind of kid, played baseball, football, basketball through high school. It wasn't until my senior year of high school that I really got into the sport of triathlon. And when I went to college, I chose to go to the University of Colorado Boulder because they had a really good triathlon team. And it was at the University of Colorado that I met Andrew Hamilton, who's actually the Colorado 14er speed record holder.
Wow.
He has had that record numerous times, actually. He first got it just after we graduated college together. And as I met him in college, he kind of took me under his wing and got me into the outdoors. And I did a few 14ers with him that I think he was doing kind of recon work for getting ready on it for his first speed record attempt.
That's cool.
And I was such a novice to it. I didn't even have hiking boots. I had just a pair of basketball shoes with slick bottoms. And my first 14er that he took me up was Little Bear Peak, which is one of the hardest 14ers in the state of Colorado. And I'm going up these steep, wet, rocky walls in basketball shoes. It was really exciting. I fell in love with it, and Andrew and I did a few more 14ers together, and I started just kind of mirroring what he wore and his climbing tactics and what gear he had. I kind of started mirroring that. He was kind of my role model for climbing mountains.
Wow. So what made you want to get into climbing more peaks outside of Colorado 14ers?
Well, I had such a good time climbing the Colorado 14ers. I finished them all in 10 years. The last one I did was Uncompadre Peak in Colorado in 2007. That was my last one. And after I finished that, there's what's called the Centennial Peaks of Colorado, which are the next 46 highest 13ers, which will make up the top 100 highest peaks in the state. I started working on that, and I have about 10 left. And those are great mountains to climb because there's not many trails and not many people on those peaks because they're not the 14ers, which are the most popular mountains in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So just out of the love of climbing mountains, I started branching out as I had time to do so. And I would start traveling the West, primarily doing other big mountains in California, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Utah, and just climbing all over the place. And I kind of created a list of significant mountains. And I kind of had an elevation baseline that I would use for each state. Like
Mm-hmm.
Utah, for example, doesn't have any 14ers, but they've got a handful of great 13ers. And so I would make the 13ers of Utah my goal, to climb all the 13ers in Utah.
Cool.
And same thing with other states. I would make these lists based on typically elevation baselines.
So a lot of high pointers love lists. And so I imagine after all of the lists in different states, you stumble upon the high points.
Yes. I was in a bookstore, a mountaineering store, going through their books. I love to collect mountaineering books. And I found this book called High Point Adventures by, I think, Charlie and Diane Winger.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw I started flipping through it and I realized, oh my gosh, this is a great list to work on. Doing the high point of all 50 states. What a great project. That'll get me out of the West and get me to the east part of the country and the Midwest and Alaska and Hawaii.
Hmm.
So I thought that'd be a great project to start. And so I started doing that. And I still have that book. It's sitting right next to me right now. And I check off, the states when I finish it. I put the date next to it.
Hmm.
Add little notes if there was anything significant about that climb. And it's been a wonderful project, and I'm almost done with it.
How many high points did you have before you decided you wanted to do all 50?
I think before I stumbled upon this book and realized I want to start this 50 state project, I only had probably 4 or 5
Hmm.
states under my belt off the 50 state list.
Okay.
I had done Colorado, of course.
Yeah.
I had done New Mexico. I'd done Utah. I'd done Nevada and California.
Okay.
So I
That's
think
pretty
those
good.
5 states I had already accomplished before I started the 50 state project in earnest.
Okay. So then you started heading east. What were your first peaks that you did outside of, east of the Continental Divide?
Sure. So still racing triathlons and really enjoying Xterra brand triathlons, which are the mountain bike triathlons.
Hmm.
I looked for races that were in a certain region of the country that I would want to go do a group cluster of high points. And so I found races in the Black Hills of South Dakota, for example, a triathlon that I would go out and hit and do Harney Peak, for example, in South Dakota, and then drive up and do North Dakota, do Iowa, and other states in that region, and then come back home and do,
Yeah.
make it like a 10-day road trip, hitting as many states as I could in a region, mixed with doing a triathlon along the way.
Wow. That sounds exhausting and amazing.
There were other trips that I would do that didn't involve a race,
Hmm.
that just were strictly high pointing. Like once I flew to St. Louis and rented a car at the airport and just did a big, huge loop of the South and got all my southern states, even down to Florida,
Hmm.
and then Alabama, Mississippi, and all the southern states. And I would finish by coming back up through Memphis and take a tour of Graceland. And what's great about that book, High Point Adventures, is they've got notes in there for each state on sightseeing opportunities that you could do along the way outside of the high point. And
Hmm.
I took great advantage of those sightseeing tours along the way. It was very fun.
Yeah, I think high pointing is one of the best ways to see the country. A lot of guests say that it takes you to places you would never find yourself otherwise. And I'm not talking about standing on a high point. I mean, on the way to high points.
Absolutely. It's the journey that is the goal.
Yeah.
The whole
Yeah.
process of the trip is what I get joy from, not just being on some high point.
Now you're also an avid hiker and you are 90% complete with the Triple Crown. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
and you are projected to complete it in summer 2026, so you're almost there.
That's right. I started the Pacific Crest Trail back in 1998 with the goal of through hiking it because I had just finished college and I didn't think I'd ever have 6 months at hand again to do something like that. So I set off to through hike the PCT with no other aspirations at the time of the CDT or the Appalachian Trail, just the PCT. And I only made it 180 miles before I struck deep, deep snow. Snow that was causing everybody going northbound to skip Southern California and head up north and flop back. And I was a real purist at the time, and I didn't want to do that. But continuing north as it was impossible. So I actually
Hmm.
bailed, came back home, and I was pretty depressed at the time, but I swore that I would come back every year to the PCT and just do a section. And it was at that time I became a section hiker.
Yeah.
And for the last 26 years, I've been hitting the PCT in various distances. every year. And I'm now up to Snoqualmie Pass, Washington, on the
Yeah,
PCT. So I have just, about 280 miles left on that trail.
it's
And it
amazing.
was in 2006 that I realized, gosh, the Continental Divide Trail is another great national scenic trail. And it goes right through my home state.
Hmm.
I could start that and probably catch up to where I'm at on the PCT distance wise in a short amount of time with a lot of weekend trips, even day trips as it comes through Colorado close to home. And I did that. I started in 2006 on the Continental Divide Trail, and I've done it every year, just like the PCT. And I've caught up. I'm now up to Rogers Pass, Montana,
Wow.
which is just under 300 miles to Canada. And
Wow.
then in 2009, I decided, if I'm doing the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail now, I might as well start the Appalachian Trail. And so in 2009, I started that. And I'm going northbound on all three. So I started in Georgia in 2009. And again, I've hit it every year. Uh, and my sections are just about a week, week and a half. That's about all I
Okay.
do a year.
That's doable.
And I caught myself up on that trail. And I'm now up to Pinkham Notch, New Hampshire.
Wow.
And again, just about 290 miles from Mount Katahdin in Maine.
Which will be
So
your
I'm
50th high point.
that's correct.
Yeah. Well, we'll get there in a minute. I want to go back to the PCT. Where exactly in Southern California did you turn around? And I asked that because I was doing the Three Saints, San Antonio, San Gorgonio, and San Jacinto this spring, and there was a lot of snow on San Jacinto, and I was post-holing everywhere. And I did run into some PCT hikers who were just like, I don't ever want to go through this again.
Right. It was on San Jacinto that I had to bail. And there's a side trail that goes right down into the town of Idlewild.
Yep. Hmm.
That's where I bailed from, was Idlewild. I
Yeah.
was able to hitchhike to Palm Springs and fly
Hmm.
home from Palm Springs.
Okay. I after I climbed San Jacinto, I went to Big Bear Lake for another day hike, and it was called Bertha Peak. And there's a section in Bertha Peak where it intersects with the PCT. And so I ran into a couple hikers, and they were through hiking. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. I'm going to talk to them. And so I was like, hey, how's your hike going so far? And they're like, oh, we're just exhausted. They spent the night in Big Bear the night before, and they had all these hamburgers and like showers and stuff. And they were just so happy from that. And they're like, it's so hard to get back on trail after you had that night. And I think I just got a little too excited. And I said, oh, so are you guys going to do the Triple Crown, or what's next after this? And they're like, we just want to get through this section. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, totally understand. Sorry. But I was, I looked at them and I'm like, I want to do that one day. But I think we think of these hikes as like these chunks of our lives that that are not possible to devote that time to. But we never really, I think, give a lot of thought to section hiking and how doable it can be in chunks. And like we were saying in the conversation before I hit record, it's like you always know where your vacation is going to be that year, or at least one of your vacations.
Yes. Section hiking has so many advantages, and it's really enriched my life because I get to pick what week of the year I do each section. Whereas you
Yeah,
start a through hike, you're going to hit some sections of trail that aren't ideal for that time of year. It's just inevitable.
you're right.
But when you section hike and you just do, let's say, a week, like I do, you get to pick the perfect week of the year that you like the weather, the trail conditions, the snow levels, whatever you want, you get to pick it.
Mm-hmm.
And just going out for a week gets you away from your life, away from the city for a vacation. And just when you're starting to get real tired and ready to get off the trail, your trip is done and you get to go home.
Yeah.
So it's a great way to do it. And to get to see all three trails every year is really fun.
Yeah. 3 very different parts of the country. So were you high pointing when you started the AT? because you would hit a couple high points, right?
Yes, I was high pointing by then,
Okay.
in 2009 when I started the AT. And that's one reason I saved Virginia, Tennessee, New Jersey,
Hmm.
Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine for my actual Appalachian Trail hiking to get
Yeah.
those high points because those states are right on the trail.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
And that's one reason I've not finished Maine yet is because it's the northern end of the Appalachian Trail and I'm just saving that for last so that when I finish the Appalachian Trail in 2 years atop Katahdin, that'll be not only my 50th state high point, but it'll be the end of the Appalachian Trail for me and the end of the Triple Crown for me, all in one mountain.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I am really glad that you timed it like that with the Triple Crown and then Katahdin being your last. Of course, you did Denali. When did you do Denali?
I did it in May of 2021. So they had
So
just
why then?
reopened.
And why not? A lot of guests will save it as their last, and there's reasons for doing both. I think a lot of people have trouble finding 21 days to take off of work. It's more money, I think, than most high points, and then there's the travel, and then
Right.
you want to take all the time to get into shape. So what was your thought in doing it when you did?
So Denali is a huge commitment, not just time, but financially
Hmm.
and physically. And so it needed to be right in my life.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until 2021 that I really had the time off in my situation at work to take 3 weeks off.
Hmm.
It was not until 2021 that I had really the finances to commit approximately $11,000 to
Yep.
the climb itself. And really, it wasn't until 2021 that I had a really high peak under my belt to know that I was going to be okay at 20,000 feet. I did Kilimanjaro in Africa in 2019,
Okay.
and that mountain is 19,300 feet. So it's exactly 1,000 feet less than Denali. But it's a great test piece to know that your body can handle high altitude. So 2021 was just the right time in my life for all those things to come together. And fortunately, it was the first year after the national park had been shut down by COVID in 2020.
Yeah.
There were no climbing expeditions allowed on 2020 because of COVID. And so 2021 was the first year it reopened, and I was lucky enough to get on a squad with a guided tour company to do the mountain.
And
And
what
so
guide service did you use?
I used AAI,
Yeah. Okay.
Alpine Ascents International.
And how was your summit?
It was wonderful. We summited on May 31st, and we had a little weather window that we took advantage of. And I'm glad we did because the weather window disappeared the day after we came off the mountain. And a lot of the teams that were just a day or two behind us heading up the mountain, I understand had a very low success rate that year in summiting because the next storm that came in lasted quite some time.
Wow.
And so we were just in that right time. And the weather dictates everything on Denali. You don't move up that mountain unless the weather's good. And when it's not good, you just hunker down and wait for good weather to come around. And so the weather dictates everything, and we got lucky.
So I know that the guide services in 21 days are giving a couple days as a buffer. How many days did it take you and your group?
We had, I think, 4 or 5 bad weather days built into our itinerary,
Hmm.
and we used up, I think, all but one day. We had one
Okay.
spare day left, I think, in our itinerary. So we came back down a day early, which is cutting it close.
Yeah. Yeah.
We really only had one extra day. And had that weather window not happened, we would have run out of time on the mountain and had to come down without a summit.
Yeah. Wow. And so for training, you obviously are in Colorado, and I assume that you just did some maybe climbs locally, or did you do anything in particular? I mean, apart from Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, apart from Kilimanjaro, my training just consists of Primarily, I'd say triathlon type training. I swim, I
Hmm.
bike, I run on a weekly basis just because I love all three of those sports.
Hmm.
I don't compete that competitively anymore, but I still do all three sports just because I enjoy all three and they keep you really fit.
Yeah.
As far as getting into the mountains for some higher altitude stuff, I ski a lot in the wintertime, and most of that is cross country skiing. I really love skate skiing, and so cross country skiing at 10,000 feet is a really good workout for your cardiovascular system and getting your red blood cells activated. So
Yeah.
that's about what I would do as far as altitude training while I'm here in Colorado.
Yeah. Well, let's get into your most recent visit to the White Mountains. Now, you were out there this summer and you were doing that portion of the AT. You also summited Mount Washington. And then you had an incident that required a search and rescue to come and get you. Um, I don't want to tell your story. I want you to do that. So, can you take the listeners through that experience?
Sure. So it was this September, when I went out to do a 144-mile section of the Appalachian Trail through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I started my trip from Hanover, which is on the western side of the state, and I was going northbound through the White Mountains with the goal of finishing in Gorham, New Hampshire, which is just before the Maine border. And I was on day 10 of an 11-day trip. And on day 10, I woke up that morning on September 21st from the Lake of the Clouds hut where I had stayed the night before. And I had breakfast at the hut, and I left around 7:45 in the morning to start my section that was going to take me from Lake of the Clouds hut over Mount Washington and the whole Presidential Range and finish at Pinkham Notch, which is where the Joe Dodge Lodge is, which is where I was going to stay that night. And that's about a 14-mile day, but it's a very hard 14 miles. 14 miles doesn't seem like that much distance when you're talking about long distance backpacking, but the Presidential Range in the White Mountains is very rocky.
Yeah.
Big boulders. You're toe hopping from rock to rock a lot of the day. Um, so I started about 7:45 from Lake of the Clouds hut, and I made it to the summit of Mount Washington, which is only about a mile and a half from the hut, just after 8 o'clock in the morning. It was about 8:30 when I got to the top of Mount Washington. And there's a huge visitor center at the top of Mount Washington. There's a road that takes auto tourists to the top. There's a cog railway that takes tourists to the top of the mountain. There's a big visitor center and a big observation deck. It's really beautiful, though. There's a 360-degree view of New Hampshire and the White Mountains. It's really pretty. I got up to the summit again around 8:30 in the morning, and I had a tourist that had gotten off the cog railway train take my photo on the summit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my 49th state high point. So all I had left is Maine. That's all I have left. I started leaving the summit of Mount Washington, going northbound on the Appalachian Trail, and you have to go over all these Presidential Range summits before you start the descent of Mount Madison, which will take you down the Osgood Ridge and eventually to Pinkham Notch. It's a huge descent. Mount Washington is 6,288 feet, and Pinkham Notch is only 2,000 something feet. So we're looking at over a 4,000 foot drop from Mount Washington. But again, it's an up and down roller coaster of a trail on the Appalachian Trail to get to Mount Madison, which is the final Presidential Range peak before you start the big drop to Pinkham Notch. And I had made it to Mount Madison around 2:30 in the afternoon, and I start descending down Osgood Ridge. Very rocky, very steep, big gaps between boulders. And again, you're kind of hopping over rocks, tiptoeing over these big boulders. I have trekking poles with me. There's something I've always hiked with because it just adds so much stability to your walk. You often catch yourself if you take a little trip with your
Yeah.
trekking poles. It's like having four legs instead of two.
Mm-hmm.
And I had them with me on this occasion. I was about a quarter mile down from the summit of Mount Madison, and I tripped on something. I don't know what. It was probably just a rock, and it was just an innocent trip. I wasn't in a rush to get down the mountain. I wasn't going faster than I normally hike. I'm actually a pretty conservative hiker. I just tripped on something, and it couldn't have happened at a worse point in the trail. I just could not catch myself with my next step, nor could my poles catch me. It was a steep section, and there was just big gaps between these rocks, and gravity just took control so quickly, and I couldn't believe how fast I started falling just immediately from this little stumble that was just an innocent run-of-the-mill trip.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I couldn't catch myself, and I landed horribly on my left ankle, ultimately, and broke my left ankle really badly. It completely folded out 90 degrees to the left, to the outside. When I stopped falling, I sat myself up, and I immediately looked at my left ankle and saw that it was in this grotesque angle, and I knew it was broken immediately. And as I sat up on the trail to just get situated on my rear end, my foot just flopped back into place on its own. I had no feeling or control of my left foot. So I knew that I wasn't only looking at broken bones, but the tendons and ligaments, everything was broken in there. It was as if I almost sheared my foot off. I immediately took my backpack off and accessed my Spot satellite beacon that I keep in the top portion of my pack. And I activated the SOS button. I wanted to get that going as soon as possible. So I have a text message function on my Spot, which allows me to additionally send a text message of what my predicament is. And so I texted that I've fallen, I've broken my left ankle, I cannot walk. And I asked for a helicopter rescue. And when I send that SOS, it goes to the nearest 911 call center, wherever that is. And it gives your direct GPS coordinates, as well as your personal information, like your name and where you live, and also an emergency contact for them to then contact on your behalf and let them know you've been in an incident. So after I got that activated, I wanted to call 911 with my cell phone additionally, and call my wife and let her know what had happened. But my cell phone was not in my backpack. I keep it in a side pouch. That's an open side pouch on my pack, and it was not there. So I figured it had launched out of my pack during my fall. And I turned around and looked for it, but I could not see it. And my worry was that it maybe launched into the bushes off the trail, that I would never find it, or between a big crack in a boulder. But I needed to look for it. It was important that I get my phone. So I couldn't move around yet with my ankle being unsecured and unstable. So I removed from my backpack a 2-foot by 2-foot section of Thermarest foam padding that I had, that really all I had been using it for on the trip was kind of a seated pad for my rear end. When you sit on rocks during breaks, things like that. I got that out, and it made a perfect splint around my left calf and ankle. And I keep duct tape wrapped around the shafts of my trekking poles, about a foot section on each pole. I took those 2 strips of duct tape off, and I secured that foam splint around my left ankle, and it kept my left foot from bobbling around.
Wow.
And at that point, I felt secure enough to scoot myself back up the trail to look for my phone. And it was about 10 feet back up the trail I found it. And it wasn't broken, thank goodness.
Wow.
I had about 60% battery life still on it. I had 2 bars of service, so I was happy that I was going to be able to make a call. And I called 911. And I got actually a 911 call center in Maine, because as the crow flies, that they were like the nearest 911 call center.
Okay.
And I told them where I was and what my predicament was, and that I had already activated my Spot beacon. And they said that they were going to transfer me to the New Hampshire side 911 call center, I think in Berlin, New Hampshire. And so they did. They transferred me in, and I had to tell my story all over again to the New Hampshire 911 call center. And they said that they would be getting the New Hampshire Fish and Game search and rescue operations rolling, and that I should be getting a call back from them in about 10 minutes. And so they said, just hang up, keep your phone on, keep it near you. and answer it if you get a phone call from us. They should be calling you in about 10 minutes. So I did that. And then I called my wife while I was waiting for Search and Game to give me a call. And I told my wife what had happened. And she immediately wanted to come to New Hampshire. She said, I need to get on a plane right now and come and see you. I said, well, let me book your flight. Because I had service on my phone. I had nothing else to do. And I've got
Yeah.
Southwest points. And so I said, I'll book your flight. I'll get you a rental car and I'll text you the details. And so I did. I found her a direct flight to Boston that was leaving in just a couple hours. And I got her a rental car on my phone app and texted her the info. And what's funny is ultimately my wife, Megan, ended up beating me to the hospital in Berlin, New Hampshire from Colorado. She got there before I did. Um, anyway, Search and Game called me. Sorry, Fish and Game, Search and Rescue called me back. I answered and explained my situation. I said, I really need a helicopter rescue. I really don't think a carryout's going to be possible. This terrain is really treacherous. Big boulders. It's going to be nighttime and dark by the time you guys get up here. And it's over 4 miles down to Pinkham Notch. I said, a helicopter can get up here and there's a decent area where I don't know if they could land, but they could certainly hover and send a cable down.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what kind of helicopter that they have, but I just didn't think a carryout was going to be reasonable. They explained to me that they would do their best and make that request with the National Guard for a helicopter because they agreed with me that the terrain was very difficult and it was going to be a very difficult carryout, but it might be our only option. They explained that the National Guard's criteria for using a helicopter rescue is that it's got to be a life or death injury to the patient. And mine really wasn't a life or death injury at this point, even though I was bleeding a lot from my left ankle because it had like sheared open a 5-inch gash in the inside of my ankle where the bones had just like jolted through the joint. I was bleeding a lot, but it wasn't life or death at this point. So the Fish and Game coordinator said he was going to get the search and rescue call out process going and that he was going to get 30 people up to me eventually for a carry out. Because ultimately the helicopter was not going to happen. So I waited on the trail about 20 minutes before the first hikers came to me. And I had been blowing on a whistle that I had. I was blowing some 3 pattern blasts to see if I could get any attention from hikers to come to my location. And it was about 20 minutes after my fall that the first hikers came upon me, and they were coming southbound on the trail, so towards me. And it was a woman named Mary DeVellis and her friend Jake Latz. And Mary identified herself immediately as a medical student, a med student. And I was so happy to hear that because she knew what she was doing and she wasn't grossed out by the blood and bones and stuff. And she said, we need to get pressure on your ankle. Like it's bleeding a lot. And she asked if I had anything to put on it. And I ended up getting a clean t-shirt that I had in my pack. That was going to be my t-shirt for the plane ride home in 2 days. I said, this is a clean shirt. Why don't you put that on? So she started applying pressure, but ultimately it kept bleeding a lot, like bleeding through the shirt. And she's like, we need to get your shoe off and your sock off so I can see the injury and know exactly what we're dealing with. So I said, well, there's no way I can pull my shoe off. It's going to have to be cut off me because I cannot bend my ankle. That would be way too much pain. So I gave her a little pair of, it was a micro Swiss Army knife with a little pair of scissors, you know, those micro scissors. I gave her that from my first aid kit, and she was unbelievably able to cut my shoe off with these little tiny pair of scissors, and my foot was able to just lift out of the shoe rather than have to tug it off.
What did that feel like when your foot came out?
I didn't feel much difference with my foot being out of the shoe. What she did next, though, she had to cut my sock off.
Okay.
And when my sock came off, I did not want to look at the injury because I was already on the edge of shock. And I thought if I look at this nasty injury, which I knew was going to be gross, I might pass out. So
Yeah.
I avoided looking at my ankle. But Mary took a look at it when she got my sock cut off. And she's like, I can see bone sticking out. And she's like, we need to get direct pressure on this. And it's going to hurt, Jason, but I'm going to be holding this pressure so we can stop the bleeding. And so she did. She applied more pressure directly on the wound. And I cried a little.
Yeah.
It was a bunch of pain. So pain I'd never experienced before.
Wow.
And she held that for hours. She was a saint. She was
Wow.
really a lifesaver. By this time, word of my injury had made it over the mountain, the other side of Mount Madison, to the Madison Spring Hut. And they'd sent staff over with some medical equipment to help out. And they brought some quick clot bandages with them. And they applied it to my ankle, and it helped stop the bleeding greatly. And so Mary got her first break when these guys came and helped address the wound and gave her a little break. But I really
She's
thank Mary
incredible.
for stopping, and uh, she knew what she was doing. She kept me engaged with conversation, and
Hmm.
we told jokes to one another, and it helped take my mind off the pain. Um,
Yeah.
so eventually, search and rescue members started making their way up the mountain. They started trickling up one at a time. And it's late. It's dark now, and it's getting cold. But again, I had
So
overnight
can I
gear
ask
with me.
the time frame between when you tripped to when the search and rescue started to trickle up?
Sure. So I tripped at 2:30, and I'd say Mary got to me just before 3 o'clock,
Okay.
and it wasn't until probably 5:30 that the people from the Madison Spring Hut made it to our location with the
Okay.
bandages and were helping out. And then it was like 7 p.m. before the first search and rescue guy made it up to my location.
Wow.
And it wasn't until like 9:30 that they'd all made it up to my location, and it got me loaded in the litter that they were going to harness me to and carry me down the mountain in.
Wow.
So it was a good 7.5 or about 7 hours up there sitting, waiting to be finally loaded up and carried down.
Wow. And were you getting cold? Were you prepared to spend the night there or
I
anything?
was prepared. I'd been backpacking for 10 days. I was on day
Yeah,
10
that's right. Yeah.
of an 11-day trip. So I had a sleeping bag with me. I had a down jacket. I had extra layers. I had gloves. I had a wool
Yeah.
hat. I had a sleeping pad. I had food and water. I was prepared to spend a couple days up there if I needed to, honestly. So I needed to get down the mountain, obviously, quickly to get my injury treated. But let's say they couldn't get to me for another day, or they were going to come up the next morning. I would have been able to stay the night up there because I had the right gear. I
Yeah.
had a headlamp. I had everything.
Yeah. Well, speaking of important gear, let's talk about this spot satellite. And
Yeah,
can you just take a minute to talk to listeners about how important that piece of gear is?
it's a lifesaver. There's different models, of course, and different manufacturers. I just have a Spot, and I don't know the name of the model, but it's a Spot, and it has the text keyboard attached. So you can actually text messages and receive text messages. And that's huge because it's one thing to be able to hit an SOS button and give a call center your coordinates and your information, and that's letting them know you need help. But it's very important that you get something that has text or some kind of communication capabilities so you can actually let them know what your predicament is and receive texts back from them that, like their ETA for getting to you or instructions on what they want you to do to self-care for yourself.
Yeah.
Um, it's a lifesaver. It really is. If you hike alone, and which I do primarily, it's a very important thing to have. In addition to keeping your family members abreast on where you're going and leaving an itinerary at home before you go on a trip. Those are also some important things to do in addition to having a satellite.
And you're a very experienced hiker. I don't need to emphasize that at all. I think you've been very clear with your experience here. Like, this can happen to anybody.
Yeah,
And the importance of being prepared, in terms of being in shape for a hike, having a map, knowing where you're going, but also bringing a first aid kit, bringing knowledge of maybe wilderness first aid, having a satellite, having a way to communicate is very important no matter how experienced you are.
that's right. And it gets repeated to me all the time by guides that I hire. There's mountains that I've had to hire guides for that are above my soloing capabilities. And every guide that I've ever had, they always tell you the same thing. It's pack wisely. Pack one more layer than you think you'll need because you never know what can happen. So even though it's going to be an 80-degree day, no rain in the forecast, and it's a climb you've done a million times before, let's say, and you don't expect any difficulties, you still need to pack for that problem that could happen to you. So you've got that extra layer, you've got that extra first aid kit, you've got your spot with you, you've got everything in case something bad happens to you. I want to add this too. My dad, he is a motorcyclist, and I'm now a motorcyclist. As an adult myself, I've got a dirt bike. He told me, he said, you don't dress for the weather, you dress for the crash.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
even though it's a 90-degree day in the summer, don't be riding your motorcycle in shorts and t-shirt and tennis
Yep.
shoes and no helmet. You don't dress for the weather, you dress for the crash. So I always dress in my motorcycle boots. I'm in my padded pants, my padded jacket with a spinal protector and shoulder pads and elbow pads, and always wear a helmet. And so I take that same philosophy into hiking. You don't hike for the weather, or sorry, you don't pack for the weather. You pack for the accident.
I had a guest on recently, Chris Hazard. He has a YouTube channel called Hiking Guy. And he's a gearhead. He loves, especially like spot satellite gear, anything SOS related. And I asked him, have you ever used it on yourself? And his answer was, no, I haven't, but I've used it for other people. So you might be like Mary on your hike, who stumbled upon an injured hiker. And then you might have to, you're in a situation where you need the tools to help someone else.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Mary was, how fortunate was that she was a medical student? Were you expecting that at all?
No, but man, it made things so much more comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's a Harvard med student, in fact. And
that's
I've
amazing.
Been in communication with Mary after this incident, keeping her updated on my recovery. And I told her immediately after this incident, I said, I need the email address of your dean at Harvard. I want to send him my story of how you saved my life, and
that's right.
Have him give you an A for effort.
That's right.
And so I've sent that. I fired off that email. She gave me the dean's email address, and he actually replied to me with a nice, kind words and wishing me well.
That is so wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, can we get back into the search and rescue effort to get you down the mountain?
Sure. So 30 members made it up to me by 9:30, and they had carried up an aluminum 10-man litter. And I got loaded into it. They harnessed me in so I couldn't roll out of it. And it's carried by 10 people, 4 on each side and 1 at the head and 1 at the feet. And this terrain is so unbelievably difficult and narrow, which makes it even more difficult because the 8 people on the sides of you carrying this litter down really can't be in the trail itself. They're on the sides of the trail, which are even gnarlier than the trail itself.
Yeah.
So these men and women of the search and rescue team were unbelievably fit and determined and dedicated to their job. And they were able to carry me down this incredibly difficult terrain at night with just headlamps. It took them, we didn't get down to the trail until 5:20 a.m. So
Wow.
it took about 8 hours to get down the mountain. And so we were going about half a mile an hour is the pace that they were covering. And what they would do is the reason they needed 30 people is because they had 3 10-man teams that would rotate shifts.
Yeah.
So a group of 10 would carry me down for about 5 minutes. And that's a grueling 5 minutes. So they would take a break when they found a level spot to set me down. And then they'd immediately switch out with 10 fresh new members who would pick me up and just continue on. And the other 20 people that weren't actively carrying were kind of ahead of the group down the trail, acting as spotters, keeping us on route and kind of illuminating the trail with their headlamps for the carriers. And they would just do this rotation every 5 minutes. The only breaks they took was when I had to go pee.
Wow.
That was the only time we actually had to stop for any significant amount of time.
Okay.
Is to let me have a nature break. And otherwise, it was a nonstop, continuous carry down the mountain.
Wow. So you get down to the base, they take you to the hospital. What did the doctors tell you?
So they did x-rays before surgery, so they knew what they were dealing with. I didn't get an MRI to look at the tissue damage because I think it was understood that I was going to be flying home immediately after this surgery and have more surgery to come back home.
Yeah.
So the doctor's mission initially just in Berlin was to get me cleaned out, get me sewn back up and secured for flight home, and that more work would come. And that's what happened. So they did x-rays. They did remove bone fragments that had splintered off the head of my tibia and fibula into my ankle joint because it just ruptured off the heads of those 2 bones in the ankle joint. So there was bone fragments he removed. He cleaned me out to prevent infection and then sewed me back up and put me in a molded splint. And then I was good to fly home. And so the following day, September 23rd, my wife and Megan, my wife, had already come out. Of course, she was at the hospital waiting for me. We flew home the following day, and it was the day after that I went in for an MRI back here in Colorado, and they saw all the tissue damage, all the torn tendons and ligaments on both sides of the ankle that were going to need repair. And it wasn't until October 4th that I had that second surgery where they reattached the major tendon on the inside of my ankle with a cadaver tendon because they could not reattach my tendon. It was so blown and ruptured.
Wow.
They couldn't reattach it. The MRI report said that there was a 3-centimeter gap in the rupture. So like a full inch of separation of that major tendon. Anyway, I got that all fixed up October 4th. They repaired tendons, repaired ligaments, reattached tendons. And I'm in a new molded splint for another week now. That'll be coming off October 17th. And then I'll be put in another molded splint for another month. And it's not until November 19th that I'll be getting a walking boot and I can actually put some weight again on my left foot. PT, physical therapy will then follow for months. And we're looking at like the beginning of January before I'm able to walk on my own again, I think, without a boot. So it's a long recovery.
Yeah.
I'm pretty couch bound until then.
So do the doctors know how you got into your accident? Did you ever ask them, what are the chances I'll be able to finish my section hikes in my timeline?
You know, I asked the doctor in New Hampshire what he thought of me hiking again someday? Like, is this going to be a permanent injury that I won't be able to hike again? Or
Did you
do you think?
think that that was a possibility?
Yeah, I thought it was. The
Oh,
way
wow.
my foot had folded outward, I I nearly sheared my foot off. It was
Yeah.
that traumatic of a break. Um, I needed to know from him, like, do you think this is something I can recover from? And he said, yeah, but you're going to have a stiff ankle. You're going to maybe have arthritis, but you'll be able to hike again. It's just your ankle will never be the same, and I
Oh,
can live with that. I can live with stiffness and arthritis. I'm just going to be thankful to be able to walk again. It was as if I almost lost my foot. It was that bad.
can you talk about some other medical challenges that you faced in your quest to do all these great things outdoors?
So I was climbing in Mexico this January. I was climbing Pico de Orizaba, which is about 18,500 feet. And I made it up to 16,500 and I couldn't breathe. I just hit a wall where the oxygen I was breathing in just was not doing anything for me. I just couldn't walk and I felt very tired. And it wasn't altitude sickness. It was just, my body was failing to work and I knew something was wrong with me. So when I came back to the States after that trip, I immediately went to the doctor and I had him run some tests. And that led to more blood tests and more blood tests. And ultimately, I was diagnosed with a rare form of bone marrow cancer called Waldstrom's bone marrow cancer. And essentially, my red and white blood cell production was extremely compromised by this cancer, which also had a byproduct of this bad protein that's being released into my bloodstream, which wreaked havoc on my filtering organs like the kidneys and spleen. So I was in bad shape. I was not doing well.
Mm.
But that explained why I couldn't breathe up at 16.5 because my red blood cell production was totally compromised and I had very few red blood cells to transport oxygen through the body. I began chemotherapy shortly thereafter. This cancer is not curable, but it is treatable with chemotherapy. So I began treatments that lasted 5 months, and my last round of chemo was in the middle of July this summer. Because I'm young, I'm 48, and I'm very, I guess, fit, you could say, strong. I would only have about a week after chemo that I felt bad and just couldn't do much. But then I'd go into a honeymoon phase for 3 weeks where I felt normal. And I was actually able to still go and do my section hikes and keep climbing mountains. Nothing too high in elevation, of course.
Yeah.
But I was able to still get a bunch of high points in this summer amidst chemo.
Wow.
And I went to Hawaii with my family at the end of May into June, and I did Mauna Kea. I went to Oregon in the middle of June and climbed Mount Hood and actually skied down from Devil's Kitchen on Mount Hood. Again, Mount Hood's only 11,000 and change. So I was able to still, accomplish things at that elevation. Um, I was able to do a lot. And during those 3 honeymoon weeks before my next round of chemo. And then after chemo ended in July, um, I've still continued to do my section hiking. I went to Montana at the end of July and I did 175 miles on the
Wow.
Continental Divide Trail up to Rogers Pass. I did a 100-mile section on the PCT this summer that got me up to Snoqualmie Pass. And then in September, I went out to New Hampshire to do my section, and I was feeling great the whole trip. I felt strong. I'm at lower elevations, of course, on the East Coast, but my body was responding really well to the treatment, and I felt like I was getting back to normal.
So, what I'm hearing is there's really no excuse to not do the things that you want to do in your life. And kind of the theme that I hear, especially like when you climbed Denali when you did and you didn't save it for last, is like, do it now. Like we were talking about before in our previous conversation before I hit record. Just do it now. Do it when you
Yeah.
feel good.
If I were a motivational speaker, my theme would be do it while you can. And I'm so thankful that I did the stuff that I did when I did it, because I don't think I'd be able to do Denali now. I don't think
Mm.
I'd be able to do Aconcagua now, which I did just a couple years ago.
Wow.
And I think I was struggling with this cancer when I did Aconcagua, because I was having a very difficult time on Aconcagua, which is really high, of course. But
Sure.
I was feeling really ill. But I summited. My doctor told me that this cancer is a very slow growing cancer, and I've probably had it for 5 years. It's been progressing for about 5 years before you notice it. So
Wow.
do things while you can, because as Warren Miller, the great ski movie maker, always said, if you don't do it this year, you'll be a year older when you do.
You would not have known about the cancer had you not been on Pico de Orizaba, right?
I believe so. I didn't have any really high mountains on my itinerary for probably a couple years. And so had I not been at that really high elevation, really pushing myself and needing a lot of red blood cells to do the climb, I wouldn't have ran into that breathing trouble and realized something was wrong. So I'm very happy that I was doing a high peak when I was, because that's what got me conscious of my problems and got me treatment earlier than later.
Do you have a different perspective on life and the outdoors after your cancer diagnosis and after this accident in the White Mountains?
Yes, and believe it or not, I think my outlook on life has changed more from this ankle injury than the cancer.
Okay.
Because with the cancer, I still felt pretty functional, minus the week of chemo where you just feel like junk.
Mm-hmm.
You would then feel, at least me, I felt good afterwards. And I was very functional. I was able to still climb and do stuff. And I had come to terms with the cancer, knowing that it's treatable, that
Mm-hmm.
I can go through treatment and still feel normal. But with this ankle injury, I I felt like I went from a soaring eagle to a caged canary,
Oh, wow.
because I can't do anything right now. I can't do anything. I can't go into the kitchen on my own to make a meal. I have to rely on family to do that. I'm on restricted, non-weight bearing status with my left leg, and so
Yeah.
I don't want to damage it, and so I really can't do much of anything right now. And that's the most difficult thing to deal with, is inactivity and not being able to do things for yourself. So I cannot wait until I can walk again. And I've come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to be normal again with my left ankle. It's going to be stiff. I'm probably going to have arthritis. I can live with that, but it's going to greatly change what I can do in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I've cut a lot of mountains off my bucket list that I was going to do, but they were on the more risky end of the spectrum. And for me, it's not worth it anymore. I this injury cannot happen again. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm cutting the more dangerous things, more risky things off my bucket list, and I'm just going to focus on finishing the Triple Crown and finishing my 50 state high points and be very satisfied with just that.
That's perfect. If listeners want to know how they can donate to a cause that maybe means a lot to you, what can they do?
So the search and rescue teams out of New Hampshire that saved my life, they're a largely volunteer-based group of men and women. Even though they're run by the New Hampshire Fish and Game, there's only a few full-time conservation officers that run the show. The vast majority of the actual search and rescue folks are volunteers. And I want to pay back to them for saving my life, all the hard effort that they put into that. And so I started a GoFundMe account to raise money for those search and rescue teams. to pay for training and pay for equipment, and just to give my thanks back to them for saving my life. And so I started a GoFundMe account right when I got back to Colorado, and there's already been over $1,400 donated to the cause. And I look forward to the day next year. I'm going to pick a day to go out and personally give the New Hampshire Fish and Game team a check for whatever I've raised by then, and give them my personal thanks for saving my life.
Well, I will include that GoFundMe link in the show notes for YouTube and the podcast, and will be personally contributing myself. Now, I want to close out the podcast with the same two questions that I ask everybody. How has the outdoors and high pointing enriched your life?
So high pointing specifically has changed my life because it's gotten me to parts of the country that I would have never gone otherwise. I specifically had to go to the Deep South and the Midwest and parts of the country I would have never gone to otherwise without having the goal of doing those high points. Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned earlier, those side trips you get to do in those states, that's just as fun as getting to the high point. Getting to go to Graceland was wonderful. I never thought I'd go to Graceland, but as I was driving through Memphis, it was just kind of a last minute thing. I saw the sign for Graceland and I was like, why not? I'm here.
Yeah.
And, the outdoors in general, you got to get out of the house and you got to get away from work and get away from everything to really see the world for what it is, which is immense beauty. And there's nothing like sitting on the side of a mountain all by yourself, taking a break from a long day's hike and just watching a stream go by you. And there's nothing but the sound of nature around you. It's so relaxing and peaceful, and it just gives you a great perspective of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I often say on this podcast that our lives are so simple and we've made it that way. It's very comfortable. Life can get complicated, there's stress, but in terms of the society and the environment that we've manufactured, it can be very comfortable. And I think instinctually we seek out discomfort as a reward. I think it's very natural for us to want to suffer a little bit, specifically in the outdoors, in order to appreciate everything, your body, this earth, everything that you can do, what you're capable of. I know I'll edit this out, but I was in the Army and there were some days where we just had to, those were miserable days just in the field. Didn't matter if it rained or snowed or whatever. We were just slogging through mud, doing all these training exercises, and we were in the airborne. So we would jump into these different places, and again, weather didn't matter. We'd jump in rain and everything. And at the time I was like, oh, this is the worst. But then the things that you learn in those exercises and the bonds that you form with other people, when you get back home, the first shower feels nice, microwave and all that. But then you're like, I need to get out there again.
Yeah.
I'm not made to do this sit inside stuff.
You're absolutely right. Like when you go live in the wild for a week, it just takes a week to get this appreciation.
Yeah.
You come back home and it's like, wow, I've got everything like running water at my fingertips, clean, filtered running water right out of the sink. You don't have to treat it with anything. A cupboard full of food. You don't have to go,
yeah.
Everything is easy.
Yep.
Even down to the restroom. Everything is so much easier here that, getting out in the wild for a week lets you appreciate all the good things you've got in life.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, my final question is, do you have an outdoor-based book, documentary, or podcast that you would recommend to other listeners?
Yes, I've got two.
Okay.
Clinton McKenzie is an author who wrote 5 books that are my favorite. And it's got the same character throughout the 5 books. And they're called The Edge of Justice, Trial by Ice and Fire, Point of Law, Crossing the Line, and Badwater. And he wrote these books from 2002 to 2005. And they are fantastic books. The protagonist is a Wyoming Bureau of Investigations detective who investigates these climbing-related deaths that are suspicious. And the protagonist is a climber, a rock climber himself, so he knows what to look for in these accidents to know if there's foul play or not. And they're very nice, well-written adventure books.
That is cool.
So
okay.
if you guys want to check that out, Clinton McKenzie, the author of these 5 books, very good. And then the
awesome.
other thing I follow is I'm a member of the American Alpine Club.
Mm-hmm.
And every year they come out with the American Alpine Journal, which is a comprehensive guide of the world's most significant climbs for the previous year. And so climbers from all over the world submit their stories on the climbs they've done all over the world. And usually they're new routes or extraordinary lines that haven't been done before or repeated for a long time. And they're very well written. And they also publish annually a book called Accidents in North American Climbing, which is a great read if you want to learn from others' mistakes. Mm-hmm. It talks about rope errors, protection errors, and malfunctions. And it's a great read to learn about the mistakes of others.
It's a really good set of recommendations. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on the show. I think your story is very important for everyone to hear. Obviously, you're very accomplished in the outdoors, and it's fun to talk about high pointing and the different section hikes and all this. But I want listeners to come away learning lessons from your story, not just the tactical, like bring this on a hike, bring that, but big picture stuff. If you want to do something, go do it now.
Don't be afraid to get out there and go for your dreams.
Yeah.
Because they'll disappear if you don't.
Yeah. Well, I will leave the link to the New Hampshire Fish and Game Search and Rescue GoFundMe account that you started in our show notes. And I wish you the best in your recovery for your ankle and in your cancer treatment. And please keep us updated with the rest of your AT section hike and your 50 state high points.
Thank you. I will. Appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lauren.